Good deal.
Yep. Yep, I think so. Yep.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the community table. We want to thank our partner, Anthem Medicaid, for making this series possible. Today, we have with us Mr. Art Crosby, who is the Executive Director of the Kentucky Fair Housing Council, and he's going to review some of the HUD-mandated rules for shelter and housing providers around equal access and families not separated. If you have any questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat. Art, you have the floor.
All right, thank you. I'm going to share my screen here. So my name's Art. I'm with Kentucky Fair Housing, and we're a nonprofit organization that operates throughout Kentucky. So we do a bunch of different things. We do investigate claims of housing discrimination. So we provide legal advocacy and representation to individuals who feel they've been treated different based on one of the protected classes that we'll talk about. We serve the entire state of Kentucky. One of the unique things that my office does is testing. We'll send out African-American, white person, male, female, person with a disability, person without, just to see if they're being treated different in different housing scenarios. And we also do a bunch of training and outreach. But that's what our office is here for, is to try to make sure people and it's really easy for me to do a fair housing training where I say don't treat Black people different than white people. That's pretty easy. What we spend a lot of more time here is trying to talk about some gray areas, some new evolving areas, some things that can be a lot more challenging. But getting on the history real quick of how we got here and how protected classes came to be. Up until April 11th, 1968, you really could treat anybody different for any reason you wanted to, including race and all the other ones. April 4th, 1968 was the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We talked a lot about what the man did while he was alive, but interesting to note that as part of his passing, within a week, they passed the Civil Rights Act. That was on April 11th, 1968, partly to stop riots, but it's partly in commemoration of what the man did. So in 1968, you had the 4 original protected classes that were covered: race, color, national origin, and religion. So those were the ones that were set out from the beginning in 68. You had to wait 6 years before the government came around to adding gender. In 1988, Reagan signed into law protections for disability and familial status. So those are your federal protections. Different cities have different protections. So Louisville in 1999 added sexual orientation and gender identity. In 2021, Louisville added protections for homelessness, military service, criminal history, and source of income, which means you can't say no Section 8 if you're a landlord. And talking about how that sexual orientation and gender identity, Louisville again first adopted in 99. Then you had a few other counties in Kentucky that started adopting it. Lexington also in 99, Covington in 2003, tiny little town of Vico in 2013. So anybody want to guess how many counties currently provide protections for in the chat, guess how many counties in Kentucky currently provide protections for sexual orientation, gender identity? Somebody give me some guess. 20. It's more than 20. Anybody else? It's all 120 because it's a trick question. All 120 counties in Kentucky now protect based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So let's keep that in mind, because it comes from this Supreme Court case, Bostock versus Clayton County, which was June 2020. And it was a 6-2 court decision by the Supreme Court, including some recent Trump appointees. And here's the facts of there were 3 different cases that came into one. And the first one was Clayton County, Georgia, fired Gerald Bostock for conduct unbecoming a county employee shortly after he began participating in a recreational softball league for gay individuals. Altitude Express fired Donald Zarda days after he mentioned being gay. And RMG and GNR Harris Funeral Homes fired Amy Stevens, who presented as male when she was hired, and after she informed her employer that she planned to live and work full-time as a woman. So all 3 of those cases went all the way up to the Supreme Court, were decided together. And the court said, and the court decision was, because discrimination on the basis of homosexuality or transgender status requires an employer to intentionally treat individual employees differently because of their sex. An employer who intentionally penalizes an employee for being homosexual or transgender also violates Title VII, which basically means, I'm just taking you back here, that as of 1974, when we protected gender, we are protecting gender orientation, gender identity, sexual orientation. All of that is considered protected under the Supreme Court under this case. So it's an employment case, but all the reasoning, all of it still applies just as much to housing. So that's sets off some really interesting things about where we go from here. But the first part is, what does fair housing cover? And basically, there's anything to do with any type of housing. So you can't deny housing's available, refuse to allow somebody housing, or retaliate for exercising their fair housing rights on any of those protected classes. Also keeping in mind, it covers almost any type of property, right? So homeless shelters are covered, university dorms, student housing, rooms for rent, nursing homes, all of these things are covered under the Fair Housing Act. Shelters are covered basically because the Fair Housing Act covers anything that's called, it's a dwelling, anything that's a home. So again, dormitories, nursing homes, group homes for individuals. Basically, you're looking at length of stay, whether or not the occupant intends to return there, whether the occupant has anywhere else to return, whether occupants view the building as their home, whether or not there's a rental potential lease. It's not something that covers prisons, hospitals, or temporary stays at hotels. So those places are not covered under the Fair Housing Act, but almost anything else is. Especially, again, as long as it's a home to somebody. So shelters are covered under the Fair Housing Act. This then brings us to HUD's Equal Access Rule, which is where we'll spend a lot of time. And I kind of wanted to preface this by just talking about what I see as why I see this issue as so important. And part of the reason I see this issue as so important is because I can see with my daughter's generation and how their approach to gender is completely different than the idea of gender that I grew up with. And I understand, like, my daughter's generation also, as they're going out and starting to rent property, or as they're getting ready, my daughter's just, you know, she'll start her senior year in high school, as they go out to the college or get a dorm, like, they're going to be encountering people who have very different ideas of gender than they do. That is a telling time of when discrimination cases will occur, is when you have one generation growing up with one idea interacting with another generation that has a different idea. And I believe, and we've already started to see, these will become just a hotbed of discrimination issues when these two kind of cultures and understandings come into conflict, which is why we have these type of rules to kind of guide, especially places that receive any type of federal funding. So the HUD Equal Access Rule applies to shelters that receive monies from HUD's Office of Community Planning and Development, and as well as recipients and subrecipients, and applies to general shelters and same-sex shelters. And basically, the 2016 idea was that transgender individuals should be housed with their gender identity, the gender the person identifies with. And shelter placement is to be made in accordance with their gender identity. You cannot subject individuals to intrusive questions, and you can't require documentation of an individual's gender identity. So you can't go around asking people to show you their anatomy or try to prove what gender you think they might be. We're letting individuals, which, to be honest, is how we've always done it. People have always been able to select which bathroom that they've wanted to use. We've never had people who monitor bathrooms to decide who can and can't get out or check anatomy before we've allowed people to go in. But in 2016, HUD put out this Equal Access Rule. There was a 2020, under the Trump administration, HUD had proposed a modification where shelters could voluntarily establish a policy to govern admission determinations based on the person's biological sex. That, however, did not go through. And in 2021, Biden passed Executive Order 13988, which again basically says all persons should receive equal treatment under the law, no matter their gender identity or sexual orientation. So we are moving to a place where, as it says in just going back, it says we're not supposed to discriminate based on gender, right? That was 1974 put into law. So gender should be irrelevant in terms of housing placements, which is easy to say, but sometimes can be a little more difficult in actual practice. There are just some basic questions that do still come up and will continue to come up for some time. It's because this is a relatively new, slightly shift in thinking. Can a homeless shelter only allow men and women at a shelter anymore? Well, we'll talk about that. But it's getting to the point. I did a presentation for the Coalition for the Homeless probably 15 years ago where I was telling people, like, we're not going to continue to have gender separated shelters. So we need to start thinking about that. And it certainly seems like we're on that path. Can a shelter ask about a person's gender? Can a shelter let a person select potential roommates based on gender? Does a shelter have to refer to people in the shelter by the gender they identify with? And what responsibilities does a shelter have if a person at the shelter harasses another person on the basis of their gender expression? We'll kind of go in through all of those. And as we go through it, people do have questions. Again, put them in the chat. These are all new. You all will have encountered things that I have not even begun to think about yet. And I fully realize that. And some of this will be me thinking through stuff on the fly or just trying to come up with stuff. But we are starting to see more and more as the issues come, these things are becoming more and more refined. When HUD did this 15 years ago, they were pretty much punting on it, right? They just said, well, you have to make sure you're serving individuals who are transgender. We don't really care how. Now HUD is very specific in this. It's not the same. So it's clear now that shelters may have to adjust policies, may have to provide single occupant bathing facilities if necessary. We'll talk some more about that. They must document and maintain records of compliance, and that individuals who present as non-binary, gender fluid, or gender non-conforming, if gender is going to be relevant to the placement, then the individual is going to be asked for their preference for placement. It's not something where we're going to choose the gender placement for people. And I wanted to again, just reset real quick, just basically under the law, even though we haven't always thought about it like this, the law says you are not supposed to treat people different in housing because of their gender. So that idea of having separate gender dorms would seem to be against what the law kind of sets out. So there were some specific protections under the state. Now, this is the state law. The state law has 5 specific exemptions for that allow gender discrimination. Single-sex dormitories, like the YMCA and YWCA. A landlord who refuses to rent to an unmarried couple of opposite sex is still protected in Kentucky under the statute. A landlord who chooses to rent only to men or only to women, provided that he doesn't do more than 10 persons or self-contained units in an owner-occupied housing accommodation. So if the owner is actually living there, he can limit it to only men or only women. Rooms or rental units where tenants have to share bath or kitchen facilities, and other accommodations that might have to be based on personal modesty or privacy. So these are 5 exemptions written into Kentucky law. This doesn't apply at all, however, because these exemptions don't even exist under federal law. So the federal law does not even exempt these things. The federal law doesn't have any specific exemptions for dormitory. The federal law just says you're not supposed to discriminate based on gender at all or treat people different based on gender in housing, except for this one exemption, the use of words in advertisements. Nothing in this part restricts advertisements of dwellings used exclusively for dormitory facilities by educational institutions. So in advertisements, that's the only exemption there really is in gender for federal. So again, keeping in mind, the federal law says you're not supposed to treat people different based on gender. There's not supposed to be any difference. And how does that continue to shape up? Well, things just start looking different. The way I grew up, you had very specific universities that had very specific dorms based on men and women. That's not necessarily where we're going anymore. Duke University has single gender floors. They do have some, but again, it's they also have gender inclusive housing where individuals' rooms or suites where the gender of the roommate is not taken into consideration. University of Michigan, same thing. Resident halls that have single or double rooms with private baths, gender inclusive bathroom in close proximity. Universities are changing because they're going to have to. The same thing, historically, you had retirement communities that were that had different thoughts about gender and sexual orientation. This one is from 2016. It's a place out of St. Louis, Friendship Village. Mary and Bev were married. Friendship Village wouldn't let them live there because of their cohabitation policy that allowed only housing to couples who had a marriage consisting of one man and one woman as the marriage is understood in the Bible. They sued for sex discrimination. And basically the idea was that if either woman had been a man, they would not have been rejected. So you were rejecting them based on gender. Originally, after the Supreme Court made their Bostock decision, the court said, yes, that's a valid claim, and that case settled. And there, I want to just kind of emphasize the religious aspect here. I was doing a presentation for Housing Authority maintenance workers. So it was about 6 or 7 months ago. And I was talking about gender, trans, sexual orientation, all these issues, and explained that you can't treat individuals different. And one of the maintenance workers came forward and said, this is against my religion. I don't feel comfortable with this. I can't, in good conscience, kind of work with individuals who don't kind of follow my idea of what gender, his religious idea of what gender should be like. And we just had to have a frank discussion, then you probably can't be in this business. You cannot provide housing or work in housing or have anything to do with housing. You can still have your religious beliefs. The laws aren't trying to dictate what your religious beliefs are, but the laws are trying to dictate freedom for individuals in housing, regardless of their gender. And it really is not any different than if a maintenance worker was Christian or didn't feel comfortable, believed that Jewish people were against his religion, or believed because they don't believe in Christ, or Christ is the Son of God, or that he doesn't, Muslims don't believe what he believes. You're not one to house Muslims, or you're not one to house people of the Jewish faith, then you're not going to be allowed to be in the housing business. So they did a study in 2016 where they tested homeless shelters. They did 100 phone calls to homeless shelters across 4 states. They found only 30% were willing to house transgender women with other women. 13% wanted to house transgender women in isolation or with men. 21% refused service altogether, and 21% could not answer or were unsure. Some of the issues that came up during those phone tests, they referred people to using the wrong gender, statements made by staff to discredit the gender identity. Staff made statements about requirements for housing based on the tester's genitalia or completed surgery, and staff making comments that other residents would be made uncomfortable or feel unsafe because of that person, and that therefore they shouldn't be staying there. So one of the things that's really important is frontline staff, or people who do interact, is to kind of understand, at least have a basic idea of what we're talking about. The idea of sex, their person's biological status, gender as a social construct, a person's gender identity, meaning one's own internal self of their self and their gender. Gender expression is how they present outwardly, the difference of how those are different than sexual orientation, and the terming of transgender or trans, so somebody who is transitioning. And then the idea of cisgender or cis, which describes a person's gender identity that aligns with the sex they were assigned at birth. And then additional terms like somebody who's non-binary, does not necessarily fit into one of the 2 gender terms, somebody who's agender, somebody who's gender expansive. And again, I talk about all this because it's not an issue where I necessarily need every person on the frontline staff to have a full understanding of every term that you might encounter, because you'll never be able to do that. There will be new terms coming up. People will have new ways to describe themselves. That's going to be a given. What I think we need, though, is people at frontline staff and people in administration and people working with our population, people who are helping to house others, not to roll their eyes when they hear a different term, not to make a funny face, not to be just aghast or exasperated or sigh or breathe deeply, but to be able to be open and hearing these terms, understanding that people are going to be have different ideas than what might have been in the past, and to be tolerant, and to be not just tolerant, but to be open to these as they come in. So again, I don't need you to have everything memorized. I know I'm nowhere near a full understanding of all the different terminologies, but to make sure discussions and not recoiling, or again, one of the things that we do hear a lot about is people with the issues and pronoun. People still hear me okay? I'm getting some notes on my internet.
No, you're good now. You cut out for a second, but you're okay.
Right. So we do get some people pushing back on pronouns. We get people trying to make funny little jokes, but we also get some landlords and housing providers, shelter workers who are legitimately concerned about it. but they're worried they might not get it right all the time. Because there are, again, people, she, he, hers, he, him, and then other ones, or just using different names. And I think it's not a perfect analogy, but here's the best I can offer to people. Are you going to get sued under fair housing law because you use the wrong pronoun? Probably not. And the analogy but can you get sued if you keep screwing it up? Maybe, right? So the analogy I use is, just think of an older woman who calls everybody sweetie or honey. And they've been doing it all their life. They just keep calling people sweetie, honey. And somebody comes in to rip from them, they call them sweetie. Are they going to get sued for sexual harassment? Probably not. And even if they did get sued, they're probably not going to lose, right? Like, calling somebody sweetie or honey once is probably not going to get you sued. But if the person takes offense and says, look, I would just prefer that you not call me sweetie or honey, right? The person should try to take that into account. And if the person later slips up again, calls them sweetie or honey, but then apologizes. But no, we're not talking to over apologize. Like, just, I'm sorry, I'm working on it. I'll try to get better. They're probably not going to get sued either, right? Like, they are trying to make adjustments. They're doing their best, but they should be respectful and understand that they need to change. Now, the difference, though, is somebody who calls everybody sweetie or honey. Somebody says, hey, that's making me feel uncomfortable. Can you please stop? And then they start doubling down and calling them sweetie or honey every single time just to make a point. Are they going to get sued? Yes, they're going to get sued. And that's gender harassment. You're harassing somebody and using, basically it's gender harassment. The same thing I think would apply. If you call somebody by the wrong pronoun, you forget, or you just mix up, or you're having difficulty with it, are you going to get sued? No. If they correct you and you still mess up once or twice, you quickly apologize and move on, are you going to get sued? No, you're still doing the best. But here's where your issue is. If you double down and you keep purposely calling somebody by the wrong pronoun every time just to make a point, yes, you will get sued. Yes, that will be a problem. People, does that make sense? There are easy ways to avoid this. Again, you can just use a person's name. You can use they, them is pretty good and can be gender neutral, even if you don't know how they refer. It just makes sense. And this is important for frontline staff. It's important for new hires. It's important for everybody who's interacting. Some basic operating terms too, just not just with trans issues, but people of color, people with disabilities instead of disabled people, differently able versus people with disabilities, but also the idea of outsider identification versus self-identification. You might have individuals in your shelter who refer to themselves with different terms. Just because they're referring to themselves within their in group as different terms does not mean that you should be doing that. Again, HUD, after having gone for a while without making specific issues with examples, has really become much more aggressive in terms of how they apply, and saying that if people do treat people different based on their gender, that is going to be considered gender discrimination and potentially liable. You could get sued, and your supervisor could get sued, and the whole operation could get sued. And it applies again to building manager, leasing agents, shelter workers, frontline staff. Even if they're just filling in a day, everybody can get covered on this. And again, bringing to the points kind of where we get more issues as we're kind of undergoing changes from the past, right? So is it okay for a project or a service permitted by statute or regulation to segregate services based on gender? Which is just the big question. Can we still have male or female shelters? And while I think that's changing, it's not completely changed yet. The Department of Justice has established that VAWA-funded projects, if they can demonstrate sex segregation services are essential to the operation of the project, they can still potentially do that. But it's going to be tough. And again, the idea of just having, for example, a domestic violence shelter that only provides protection for women is probably not going to fly anymore. The idea that only women are needing of that service is probably not going to fly. HUD has established that emergency shelter or other facilities are permitted to operate single-sex projects when the project consists of a single structure with shared bedrooms or bathing facilities, such that considerations of personal privacy and physical limitations of the configuration of the housing make it appropriate for the housing to be limited to one sex. So it is still possible, but we're clearly moving away from that. And the other thing to keep in mind is that even if we are segregating based on gender, you must create policies that ensure housing and services to all eligible individuals identifying with that gender. So we're going to let the people coming in identify their own gender. We're not going to do that for them. And we're not going to segregate individuals. We're not going to treat them differently at all based on gender within that, based on what their gender expression might be. However, HUD does say if the residents, if the people at the shelter raise some concerns, then the provider must ensure that policies, while ensuring that their policies don't isolate or segregate their clients within the project. There are some other things that they can do to try to help with the privacy issues. Staff may offer a resident a room, floor, or bed that is in proximity to staff workstations. If that's something that the resident would want, staff can offer a resident access to rooms, floors, or beds set aside for residents with increased vulnerability. If that's something the resident wants, staff may offer to assist a resident in identifying an alternate project that will provide comparable services and provide a referral. But again, these are not situations where a person who's trans is coming in and we're thinking on our own that this person's not going to fit in with the shelter, so we're going to do these things. That's not how this works. When a person comes in who's trans, we are not going to treat them different. We're going to provide the same services, the same kind of shelter as we do with everybody else. These are options if they are requesting and they need it. HUD says a strategy of last resort could be to offer a client a hotel or motel voucher, which I know is what shelters historically did in the past, but this is not supposed to be a good option. The voucher must be, and if it is, the voucher must be offered for the full period of time that the original project site would be able to shelter the client, and the client has to have access to comparable services and resources, either via an outreach team or a supportive service project. So if you are saying, if the person says, I am not comfortable in the shelter, and the shelter decides to work around that option, it's got to be for the full period of time that they would be able to stay in the shelter. Any questions on that? HUD also puts in some issues with bathrooms and shower facilities, and some suggestions too, in terms of how to work through these issues. Facilities with individual use bathrooms and facilities with congregate use bathrooms are obviously the best situation, right? So you have just bathrooms that have no gender markings, or you have congregate use bathrooms with all individual stalls. HUD does fully recognize that a lot of shelters not only aren't newly built, but some of these things have been up for a long time, and renovation is not really feasible in the near future. But HUD still says you've got to make some, if nothing else, you've got to work through those issues. So other options include establishing a single-use bathroom for a client use at specific intervals during the day. Often existing staff member bathroom could be made available for this purpose. Provide certain times during the day that the bathroom can be scheduled by any client with a request to use congregate facility privately. Ensure that toilet and shower stalls have locking doors at a minimum, curtains to allow for modesty and dignity. And for shower use, considering implementing a schedule for all clients if communal showers are the only type of shower available. So if your structure is not so that you can make it so that everybody can use individually with modesty and dignity, there are steps that you're going to have to take to try to get there. Now, all this is again from HUD. This is HUD requirements, HUD regulations, and HUD examples that I'm pulling up here. HUD talks about an emergency shelter, transitional housing project, or permanent housing project that serves households with children. So one that's serving with children. So it is acceptable to limit assistance to households with children. Children is one of those things, and disabilities like this as well. There is no quote unquote reverse discrimination. You can create special services for households with children. You can create special services for individuals with a disability. It's not like race or gender or national origin where you can't provide one or the other. Children is something where you can. It's not discrimination to provide preferences for families with children. It's not discrimination to, or it's not illegal discrimination to provide preferences for individuals with a disability. But if a shelter decides to serve households with children or limit assistance to households with children, it can't limit assistance to only women with children, right? So in order to follow the equal access rule, they still have to serve single men out of household with minor children, or any household made up of 2 or more adults, regardless of sexual orientation, marital status, or gender identity, presenting with minor children. You could not limit it to just women with children. If a household with 2 or more adults, regardless of sexual orientation, marital status, or gender identity, present with minor children, you're going to have to still serve them and not able to discriminate based on the gender identity or family makeup for the adults. So in this example, emergency shelter or housing program would not be required to serve families composed of only adult members, and could deny access to these types of families, provided that you're treating all adult only families equally, right? So you can say they have to have children, but you can't decide what the adults have to look like if they have children. Any questions on that? Basically, the rule we're finding here is HUD-funded family shelters may never discriminate on the basis of gender, which is also true for non-HUD-funded family shelters. But we've seen specifically projects that have said a policy of not housing males over the age of 13 or requiring them to seek other housing, thus separating from their families. HUD's pretty clear this is prohibited by the CoC interim rule. It's a violation of the Equal Access Rule, and it's also a potential Fair Housing Act violation. So you can't have a policy of not housing males over the age of 13 or whatever age you pick. That's treating people different based on the gender.
Yeah. Natalie, do you have a question about this?
Yeah, so I started to type it in and it just got too complicated. So we do, multiple shelters have licensing that they have to comply with. And so one of the things that the licensing may say is there are 2 beds in that room. And so only a mom and 1 child can be in there, even though the mom might be fine with putting 2 of her children in the same bed. The licensing says that's not legal and you can't put 2 children in that bed. So a family will get denied shelter and they'll go to the next family that only has 1 child. Or, that has the child the right age to fit in that bed. So are there issues with any of that people are trying to weigh the 2?
I could completely, like, the idea of one federal or government regulation saying one thing and there being something conflicting else out there. I mean, HUD within itself often has conflicts, right? The idea that 2 government agencies can't always act together is not unusual. And it does put places, again, part of that, the issue here is that these are changes. These are things that 20 years ago we weren't seeing, and a lot of places are slow to move toward it. I will tell you, in this setting, like, one, if that's something that you are encountering and you have specific licensure issues, feel free to reach out to me. I think that is something where we can talk with the licensing. Section 8 historically had said the same thing about not wanting children of opposite sex being in the room together, but they've changed that as well. That will eventually change. I think this is the rule. The one here is the one that's going to stay. The licensing rules are going to eventually kind of change, I think, to modify based on gender. If there is something, right now, just being aware that if individuals choose not to take the thing because it doesn't fit for them, that's different. But if you are separating, or you yourself have a policy, even if it is based on your licensure, you're still going to be considered in violation of the CoC Equal Program Rule and Equal Access Rule. Now, sometimes we all know that there are situations where if you've got to choose one or the other, and you're just going to have to make what's the right business decision, or but there's no caveat here that if you have a licensure issue, that it's going to exempt you.
Art, can I ask a related question? So we're seeing a number of families who are it would be like a grandma, a mom, and a minor child, or a mom a 20-year-old child, a minor and a minor child, are those, as they identify as a family, are those kind of family units allowed to be served in family shelter, or can the shelter say, no, not the grandma, or no, not the adult child?
Okay, so I'll move forward a little bit and then we'll kind of come back and cover everything else too, okay? But yes, I mean, the quick answer is you're supposed to, if you're within the CoC, if you're one of the HUD funded properties, so if you're one of these, you're supposed to take families as they present themselves, right? So HUD assisted programs to ensure compliance with HUD's Equal Access Rule. You've got to determine eligibility for housing regardless of a person's sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status. You have to grant access to HUD assisted programs or facilities consistent with the person's sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status. Not asked to provide anatomical information, address privacy concerns raised by any residents or occupants. And then the Equal Access Rule defines family as follows. Family includes, but is not limited to, regardless of marital status, actual perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, the following: single person who may be an elderly person, displaced person, blah, 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 or a group of persons residing together, and such group includes, but is not limited to, family with or without children, an elderly family, a near elderly family, a disabled family, a displaced family, the remaining of a tenant family. But it's basically, the idea is the family includes, but not limited to, regardless of marital status, actual, blah, 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 any group of persons presenting for assistance together. So really, what I'm trying to get here is, under this, family is any group of persons presenting for assistance together, with or without children, irrespective of age. So this, according to HUD, and all of this is just stolen straight from HUD. I'm being completely honest and transparent here. I just cut and pasted on my slide. It's nothing that I'm creating myself. What this means is that any group of people that present together for assistance and identify themselves as a family, regardless of age or relationship or other factors, are considered to be a family and must be served together as such. Further, a recipient or subrecipient receiving funds under the ESG or CoC continuum of care programs cannot discriminate against a group of people presenting as a family based on the composition of the family, the age of any member's family, the disability status of any member's marital status, actual received, or gender identity. Does that answer?
That does answer, thanks.
Yeah.
So sorry for having you jump around there.
No. A permanent supportive housing project under the CoC program rule that serves chronically homeless families. If two adults present together as a family, the recipient or sub-recipient must serve the two adults as a family and may not require proof of marriage, may not blah, blah, blah. So if you got mom and grandma, you've got to serve them as a family. And we know that just more different, and they don't have to be biologically related. So we just know that families are just presenting themselves in very different ways, and HUD is trying to ensure that all of those are served.
Hey, Art, I've got a question about that. We've occasionally had programs for one-bedroom apartments that we advertise as such, and we get a referral for a group that presented to the coordinated entry team as a couple, and then when they show up to do their housing intake, they want separate bedrooms, and we say, well, you got referred to a one-bedroom unit, this is what we had available. Like, you can sleep wherever you want to sleep. If someone wants to sleep on the living room couch, that's fine, but you got referred to a one-bedroom unit. Is that the right way to handle that, or should we be offering something we don't have?
No, I mean, like, if a tenant applies for a unit, a two-bedroom unit, and then they show up and they say, here's a two-bedroom unit, and they, yeah, but I've got two other people, I wanted two of these, or I wanted to, like, that's not right. Like, they're asking for something other than what they originally asked for. So I don't think that's an issue. I think you're right. I think if, there's the one-bedroom unit, that's what you came up on the list for. If that doesn't fit your needs, then you kind of have to go back into the system and apply for what you actually wanted.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks.
There's a question here. Can someone be denied housing due to a credit score? And the unfortunate answer is yes, they can, with some caveats here. So we're mostly talking about looking for an apartment, how difficult that can be in Louisville or places with where affordable housing is so difficult to find. the fair housing thing is basically you can't treat people different based on one of the protected classes, but you can still say they have to have a certain income, still have to have good references. Now you have to be doing that for everybody across the board, right? You can't have different policies in place for an old white grandma than you do for a young black male. You can't say we're going to check references on the young black male, but we're not going to check them for the old white grandma. That's a fair housing violation. The other thing that we see a lot with source of income protections now that has been going through is, so we ran into people would say, we'll take Section 8, but you individually have to make 3 times the rent. That doesn't necessarily work because an individual with Section 8 is never going to personally make 3 times the rent. So the way that law is specifically interpreted is the individual has to make 3 times their portion of the rent. So, you know, if my portion of the rent is $300, and Section 8 is paying the other $700, but my portion is only $300, I just need to make $900 because Section 8 has the other part covered. Now, there is an issue, I think, like let's say somebody has a bad credit score, but Section 8 is paying for the entire portion of the rent. Should it matter that the person has a bad credit score? I don't know. I think there's a good argument there. But as of now, if the apartment complex can point to a reason that they're using the credit score and they're doing it consistently, that's still going to be a thing that can still keep people out. Any other questions on that? One final thing kind of specifically to shelters was harassment and identity. So it's easy enough for me to say, make sure all your staff is following all this, make sure all your staff's not harassing people. It's another thing when one resident bothers another resident, because Lord knows that does happen. Like it happens in every type of community. It happens in apartment complexes. It certainly happens in senior living, but it especially does happen in shelters. And it is the way the law is set up, like the shelter is not required to always be the police, right? Like if 2 people are getting in a fight, or if there are issues between 2 people, a shelter could legally just say, look, both of you need to leave. You can't resolve this, period. But if there are 2 individuals who aren't getting together and it's because one is targeting another for a protected class, if one's bothering another because of their trans status, or one's bothering another because of their religion or their race, a shelter at that point has to help protect the individual who's being targeted based on protected class. You wouldn't want to take action against them just because they're being targeted that way. Does that make sense? And there's a requirement there to do that. Domestic violence issues, again, stuff that we see quite a bit of. The important thing to just being making sure people understand that landlords can't evict somebody. We're calling the police. Landlords can't evict somebody because supposedly it's disturbing neighbors just because they're a survivor of domestic violence. Can't charge for damages to the property from a domestic violence incident, especially, you know, we have landlords who try to charge for breaking down the door. Certainly that's not something that the victim of domestic violence should be responsible for. Landlords can't refuse to rent survivors of domestic violence, and sometimes under the law, landlords would even have to let survivors out of the lease so that they can find safe housing. Basically, that just kind of goes over. The other thing we see a lot of in gender harassment is sexual harassment. We see that especially true with people who are very housing vulnerable, especially people coming out of shelter who are desperate from housing, and the landlord is fully aware of how desperate they are for housing. We have seen they, you know, returning or asking for sex in return for housing. We've seen landlords just send horrible invitations, horrible text, those types of things. We're just making comments, all of that completely illegal, and stuff that we very much want to be notified of, because what we tend to find is if a landlord's doing it to one, they're usually doing it to more than one. And it's an important thing for us to try to figure out and stop when we can. The other thing that I can always spend some time talking about is emotional support animals. I just spend a good chunk of my day dealing with emotional support animal questions. Just running through real quick kind of the idea. So there's shelters that, since they are considered housing, do have to allow emotional support animals. There's a difference between pets service animals and emotional support animals. I'll try to go through those relatively quick, but pets are just something people like because pets are nice and cool. Service animal is something that an individual needs, and a service animal is covered under the ADA, and it's for places of public accommodation. So like shelter could potentially be, but especially like the office or places that are just open to the public, that's under the ADA. And under the ADA, you have to allow a service animal, which is an animal that's specially trained. So you're usually just thinking about seeing eye dog, that kind of thing. So that's what you can take to Target, to the mall, certified service animal. But the emotional support animal is a little broader, doesn't have to be specially trained, and it's what an individual can have with them in their home. And it's basically anything that an animal that an individual needs because of a disability, right? So they do have to have a disability, and they do have to need the animal because of the disability. Certainly, the law has been pretty decent and clear that that you're going to have to make accommodations for one animal. It's a lot less clear about 2 or 3 or 4 animals. Veterans with PTSD is almost always going to be considered a disability. So in those situations, and look, we know that with shelters that there are individuals who, if they don't believe they can bring that animal with them, they'll stay in the streets. So these are really important issues and really important things that people do need. Now, I also know that there are some people who just want an animal, and sometimes they'll go out of their way and go onto the internet and pay some money and get somebody to send them something that says like a certified. So if you see something that looks like it's from the internet, or it has a ESA.org, or it's like a little vest or a little card, those things usually aren't really valid. Those are just things somebody just got online. What we really need to see is somebody who is probably seeing somebody local. I mean, there are sometimes reasons you might have your therapist or doctor out of state or out of the city, but usually it's somebody you're seeing, and they're seeing there's a therapeutic relationship, and they're able to diagnose that, yes, this person does have a disability, and yes, this person does need the animal. If it is a service animal or support animal, you can't charge an extra fee. You can't have breed weight restrictions. It does create some potential issues in congregate housing, absolutely. But you can also put regulations in terms of, just because they can have the support animal doesn't mean the animal can just go anywhere or cause problems, or they'll have to clean up after it. Are we allowed to ask for verification that their animal is an emotional support or service animal is legit? I think in terms of shelter housing, if it's a seeing eye dog and the person's blind, I don't think you need to ask for anything more. I think that one is pretty clear. I think it's good. If it's something that's not obvious and a person wants to bring the animal into the overnight shelter, I think absolutely I would want some kind of documentation or verification to kind of support that. It's not an unusual or unreasonable request. We do know that some individuals have difficulty accessing mental health services, so it can be a problem. Can the emotional support animal be any breed? Yes. HUD specifically says you can't put breed or weight restrictions on support animals, which does pose some challenges. And I have a disproportionate number of clients who have pit bulls, which always seems weird to me, or at least it seemed a lot more weird to me until I've just started to realize that the Humane Society does have disproportionate number of pit bulls. So if somebody does not have funds, it's probably a more likely animal that they might get. But certainly that creates additional issues as well. So the support animal, something that they can have in the home, does not necessarily mean they can bring it to the dining area though. So who watches it, there are all kinds of challenges in congregate housing.
Can there be any requirements for like kenneling the animal, like at the shelter, like beside the bed? And also, I know Catherine asked about breed. Can it be any animal?
Can it be any animal? Hypothetically, it could be any animal, but like if it's an exotic animal, I think there'd have to be some reason for that animal. Like helper monkey. I don't know. I'm there. I've seen all different kinds of things. So there are potential other animals out there, and then other animals could be like a emotional support gerbil, probably less of an issue than emotional support dog. So it could be different things. There's not any specific, it's basically but you still, under any scenario, it's something you have to have need for your disability. And then again, we'll have people who say they have a need for 4 cats. It's unlikely that an individual has a specific need for each of those 4 cats. I'm not saying it's impossible. You could, again, have a seeing eye dog and then need another dog for emotional support is possible, but the animal would have to have a specific purpose. Many landlords will charge extra rent for animals. Can they charge extra for a support animal? Or they cannot charge extra rent, and they can't charge an extra deposit. One caveat I would say is, like, sometimes individuals who are desperate for housing, whether or not you always tell them up front you have an emotional support animal, that's something that people have to weigh sometimes. Certainly my office can help though with that if they get in that they can't be rejected. You can't turn them down or create additional costs for them. And my office helps with that if as needed. Anything else on emotional support animals? All right, running through some real quick best practices. Making sure that your phone operator should avoid using gender specific terms. And I will tell you this was, I've been in my work for 20 years, and this, 20 years started, we had an individual who would call, and he would be a regular caller, and his voice very much sounded feminine, and every time one of my office staff was new and started working with him, they always called him Miss, and he would always be somewhat offended. And then they would figure it out, and then the next person would come in and they would call him Miss, and he'd be somewhat offended. So I mean, these aren't new issues that coming up. But one of the best ways to just work through that is not referring to people as sir or ma'am in the first place. There are other ways we can refer. Making sure that the forms we're using to allow for inclusive reporting of gender non-conforming residents, allowing residents to select their own title instead of pigeonholing everybody into Mr. or Mrs. Making sure that any gender placements are based on gender identity, how that person, their own personal gender identity. Avoid collecting unnecessary information and ensuring staff maintains confidentiality. So again, if somebody is transgender but doesn't want others to know, if somebody has medications, making sure these can be very important, very private things to individuals, and we're going to want to make sure staff is handling that appropriately. We talked about harassment, so just making sure that staff understands that there's a written policy regarding how harassment cases will be handled. And then training staff on trauma-informed interventions is always a good deal. There is my contact information, so when people do have issues that come up, because again, I completely know you might cover everything that's happened so far, and you all are just in a world where new things just come up that are out of the blue that I would never have thought of on my own, and there's no way to fully anticipate, and those are just things we're going to have to try to work through together sometimes. Any other questions?
I'm going to ask one while if anybody else has questions, put them in the chat. This is kind of related to Catherine's question about landlords maybe charging rent for support animals. Can you talk through just briefly how to help a client make a request for reasonable accommodation or modification, and then also like for the people who are housing providers, how they respond to those requests?
Sure. So under the law and under HUD, it's pretty clear that a person doesn't have to use any specific magic words, does not have to use any specific forms. So if a person, we'll use the support animal, but just person says, hey, landlord says we don't allow cats. Person says, I need it for my disability. I need it for my PTSD. That's enough to make the request. They don't have to say I'm making a reasonable accommodation under the Fair Housing Act. There's no such requirement. The landlord can ask for additional documentation. The landlord could ask for the tenant to fill out forms, but while you can require verification, we have a verification form we use, which is basically 2 questions. Are they disabled? Do they need it because of disability? And verifying that. The landlord can ask for additional forms, but you can't require additional forms other than that. Like if there's additional paperwork a landlord wants to use, that's fine. But if you're still obligated to make the accommodation if they've made the ask and have at least verified the need. So The other thing is just if a tenant is in that situation, that is something my office helps with all the time. We will help send out the documentation. We'll help send out the request. We'll make sure it's all documented. We work with the landlords and any kind of issues they might have. The trick on if you're the housing provider is to make sure if a disability related request comes up, you do want to treat it differently. There's more potential for liability if you're not acknowledging it. So making sure that's documented, making sure it goes up staff if need to, or even potentially talking to an attorney. There's a couple of things, just so accommodations, you're thinking about like smaller things like a handicap parking spot, live-in caregiver, those type of things. Housing providers have to allow those if there's the need. There's also what's called reasonable modifications, and those are the bigger, more expensive things we're thinking about, like modifying rooms, like expanding doorways, roll-in showers. Those are kind of things that a federally funded housing provider is required to do if it's reasonable. And so HUD would look at like your assets and the cost, how often it comes up. If you're not federally funded, then the housing provider just has to allow it, but they don't necessarily have to pay for it. Anything else?
All right, I don't think we're seeing anything else. I don't know if you all have ever emailed Art. He's incredibly responsive. So if you have questions, shoot them to the Kentucky Fair Housing Council. They are so helpful and want everyone to get it right. And we really appreciate having you all as a resource. Ashley, do you want to close us out?
Yes. So I just want to remind everyone that our next training is on June 7th, and that will be with JCPS, and they're going to be covering the McKinney-Vento Act. So that is all I have today. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Art. And if you have any questions, yes, we're going to upload the presentation and the slides and the recording to our website. So they will be on there soon. Thank you so much.